Chapter 23. John opened his eyes as consciousness returned, and the world reappeared around him. He frowned for a moment as he tried to work out where he was. His brain was clouded over in a fog of exhaustion still. Fragments of memories swirled confusingly through his head, but he couldn't piece them together. It was normally these few moments of the day that John liked best, when for a few seconds there was no running, no hiding, and no destiny, just himself and the bed. He felt Cameron's soft skin against his arm, and the memories came flooding back. He turned his head to the side and smiled slightly at the thought of the night before. It still seemed so surreal. A fence had been torn down from between them. He didn't know what exactly they would do from here. He was surprised he didn't feel awkward, didn't leap out of the bed now it was the cold light of day. He'd been through so much to find her. There was no point denying anymore that he loved her. She lay still beside him and returned his smile. "Hey!" He inched closer to her, enjoying the feel of their bodies together. "What time is it?" He wondered. "Breakfast time," Savannah said from the desk, talking with a mouth full of fries and a drink in her hand. She tossed a KFC bag onto the bed, landing on John's legs, and shoveled another handful of fries into her mouth. She chewed noisily as she pulled the straw to her lips and sucked lukewarm orange soda into her mouth, swilling it with the food before she swallowed. John sat up in bed and tore open the paper bag, pulled out a cardboard burger box and ripped it open. The smells of the spices and herbs wafted into his nostrils, and his stomach rumbled so violently even Savannah could hear it from the other side of the room. He'd been running on such little food for so long now he'd become used to it, but with it right in front of him, he started salivating like a dog as his gut growled, demanding to be satisfied. He pulled out a Zinger Tower burger and took a large bite. "MMM," he mumbled as he chewed on the food, savoring the taste of it. Never had cold, greasy fried chicken tasted so good. "God bless you, Colonel Sanders," he murmured with a mouth full of food as he tore into the burger and demolished it in only a few bites as Cameron watched him and Savannah gorge themselves. "You'll make yourself sick," she warned. "It'll be worth it," John grinned, his lips and chin covered in grease and bits of fried spices. He handed a carton of fries to Cameron. "Want any?" he asked. Cameron took the fries and slowly started to eat them, one at a time and showing much better table manners than either John or Savannah. "Here's your Coke." Savannah got up and handed the small cup to her. "It's probably gone flat, sorry." Cameron took it and sipped on the straw. The drink had lost much of its effervescence, but she appreciated the gesture. "Thank you," she smiled. She took a few more fries and ate them, then handed the rest of the carton to John. She watched as he messily devoured another burger and shoveled fries into his mouth, not chewing properly and swallowing large chunks of food. Once he'd finished the second burger, he reached for a side of beans and started to rip the lid off, but Cameron gripped his wrist and stopped him. "That's enough," she told him. His stomach would have shrunk in size over the time in the future, and gorging himself would do more harm. "I'll be okay," John said, but she still held fast to his arm and he knew he'd never be able to break her grip. With her free hand, Cameron dropped the sheet to her waist, revealing her small, perfect breasts. All thought of food abandoned John, and he dropped the still-sealed pot of baked beans back onto the bed. She slid out from beneath the covers and allowed John full view of her body for a long moment before she reached for the clothes she'd stolen and started to pull them back on, much to John's disappointment. He took the hint and reluctantly put the remaining food back into the bag. He started to push back the covers before looking at Savannah and remembering he was also naked beneath them. He turned to Cameron, already in her skirt and putting her bra back on. "Can you pass me the clothes?" he asked. "Not like I haven't seen you naked," Savannah said, slightly amused at John's discomfort. "That was different," he said, as Cameron handed him the clothes from the floor beside the bed. He slipped the shorts on beneath the covers and pulled them up to his waist, then got out of bed once he was covered up. Once he was up on his feet, he finished dressing himself and picked up the bag of KFC, planning to finish the rest off later. It was greasy, cold crap, but it was the best he'd ever tasted. "What are those?" he asked as Savannah picked up a set of car keys from the desk. "What's it look like?" she said as she moved towards the door. "Where'd you get them from, and where'd you even learn to drive?" John asked, bewildered. "I stole it, and Ellison taught me," she answered both his questions. Even a few years into the war, she and Ellison had been living in such a remote area in Mexico that the machines hadn't been a bother for some time. She hadn't even seen an HK or a Centaur until she was 10. They opened the door and left the room. They had no baggage or even any possessions on them, so the only thing they took with them were the paper bags with the remaining takeout inside. Outside the sky was a brilliant, bright blue, and there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. The sun burned down on them, and both Savannah and John immediately noticed the simmering heat beating down on them. John shielded his eyes from the harsh glare of the sun. Having become used to living with little light and constant cold, he knew it would take time to get acclimatized to the present day. He decided he needed to get some sunglasses as soon as he could, and a change of clothes. Cameron swiped the keys from Savannah's hand and started towards the black Lexus, noting the matching symbol on the keys. "I'm driving," Cameron said as she pressed a button on the key fob, and the car's doors all unlocked. Savannah turned and stared at her, bewildered and disappointed. She'd wanted to drive. "I don't need sleep," Cameron explained. She could see the fatigue still present in both Savannah and John. They needed rest, and she could drive constantly without stopping. "Are we going to check out?" John asked as he opened the passenger door and slid in beside Cameron as Savannah took the rear seat behind them. "Why bother?" Savannah shrugged. "It's better if the clerk doesn't see us twice," Cameron said. "It makes us harder to identify." She and John were still fugitives, and they'd also stolen clothes, money, and a car last night. They needed to keep a low profile and avoid all unnecessary contact with other people. "Fair enough," John shrugged. Cameron turned on the ignition, put the car into drive, and started out the parking lot. She turned out onto the main road, heading south. Their traffic was very light on the road, but Cameron kept their speed at 45 mph to avoid attracting attention. Both John and Savannah stared out at the coast, visible up on their right. The sun shone down onto the deep blue water, and combined with the palm trees dotted around and the clean streets, it looked like pure paradise. If they had a week to wait before getting back to his mom and Ellison, and he wasn't wanted and with no money, he wouldn't have minded resting up here for a few days. "Do you know where you're going?" Savannah asked several minutes later. "Highway," Cameron pointed to a sign up ahead on their right, indicating the coastal highway route one was their next turning. She knew that would take them down to LA. Route 1 had been frequently used as a supply route for Skynet's forces between Los Angeles and San Francisco. John had deployed units of guerrilla fighters to target convoys at random sections along the long highway, depriving its installations of supplies and slowly depleting their numbers until resistance forces in the region were able to operate with considerably more freedom. Depriving Skynet of Route 1 had been a major tactical victory in the West Coast theater. Cameron turned onto the highway's on-ramp and sped up to 65. The traffic was heavier but steady along the larger road, and she kept a steady pace. As she drove, she carefully watched the other cars around them and their occupants, and from the corner of her eye, she could see John doing the same. A light blue BMW on Cameron's right contained the driver and a single passenger. a middle-aged Caucasian couple who appeared to be engaged in an argument. She couldn't hear them, so she was unsure of what it was about. Inside another car, a Ford pickup ahead of the BMW, were 3 girls in their early 20s. And in a Prius just behind them, Cameron saw through the rear-view mirror, was a lone man in his 30s. She assessed his build and gait. He was of average build, perhaps 170 pounds in height, with dark hair. He was the only occupant of his car, and the only person she could see who fit the likely profile of law enforcement. His eyes were forward, on them, and she carefully scrutinized him, concerned he could be a police officer in an unmarked car. He continued to stare intently at them, and she assessed the other cars around them in case she had to try and evade him. "What is it?" John asked nervously, noticing Cameron's eyes constantly flickering to the mirror. He knew better than to turn around and instead looked up at the mirror, and then out at the wing mirror on the car door, seeing the guy in the car behind. The driver pulled out a cell phone, dialed, and put it to his ear with one hand. He started chatting and smiling, and let out a laugh at something the other person must have said. Cameron changed lanes and sped up, leaving the car behind. She watched as the driver kept talking on his phone and made no move to follow them. She scanned the view through the mirror for any other cars, attempting to accelerate to keep up with them, and saw nothing. She stopped watching him, satisfied, and turned to face John. "Nothing," she smiled reassuringly. "Relax. We'll reach LA in 6 hours." The black Mercedes pulled into the drive of Ellison's house, and the Sarah turned the engine off, leaving the 3 occupants of the car in silence and darkness, illuminated only by the streetlights spaced out on either side of the road on the pristine, middle-class suburban street. She pulled her Glock from her pocket and turned around in the driver's seat to face Danny in the back, sat completely still and looking forward blankly. She pointed the weapon at his head, and his eyes widened like saucers, locking on to the gun inches from his face, and he instantly fell back into his seat as far as he could go and let out a whimper as he started to tremble in fear. All he could think of was how his dad had been held at gunpoint before, and he'd been dead within hours. It was his turn now, and he was scared out of his mind. "Please." Ellison looked at Danny, trying to hide any emotion on his face whatsoever. Sarah wasn't going to kill him, and even if the thought entered her mind, he wouldn't allow it. But they couldn't let Danny know that just yet. "We're going inside," Sarah told him, speaking slowly so even through the near panic he was going through, he would be able to understand. "If you make any noise or try to run, I'll shoot you." Danny just nodded glumly and made no other reply as Sarah opened her door and stepped out of the car. She slammed her door shut and then opened Danny's. "Move," she ordered. He stepped outside and stood upright, taking a moment to look around as Ellison got out of the door on his side. There were plenty of houses on either side of the road, but it was so late at night that he couldn't see any lights on in any of them. Still, he thought, surely someone would hear if she fired her gun at him. Would she risk it? Should he call her bluff? Cold steel pressed against his neck, and he felt Sarah's glare burning down on him without even seeing her eyes. "Don't even think about it," she growled. "This gun's got a suppressed barrel. No one would hear a thing." It was a complete bluff, but she was willing to bet that Danny Dyson knew nothing at all about firearms. The fact he froze and nodded sullenly confirmed what she'd thought. "Inside," Ellison said as he led the way up the small but well-kept yard and to the front door. He fished keys out of his pocket and undid the lock before opening the door. The whole house was completely dark. He stepped inside and strode through the blackness with the confidence that came from having lived in the house for years and knowing where everything was, and flicked on the light. Now illuminated, they saw an empty tub of chocolate ice cream and a large, empty bag of potato chips on the coffee table in front of the sofa, next to the TV remote. "Savannah," he called out. There was no reply. Danny came through the entrance next, followed by Sarah just behind, holding a gun to the small of his back. She closed the door after her and pointed to an armchair in the corner of the living room. "Sit," she said to him, speaking like she would do to a dog. Danny saw no other choice and crossed the room to sit in the black leather seat. Once he was down, he stared up at Sarah, still terrified of her, but now trying to work out what the hell these people wanted with him. Had to be a ransom, right? Yeah, he thought, that must be it. His dad had left behind a lot of money, and they'd always been pretty wealthy. They must have picked him because of the loss his family had already suffered, and figured his mom would pay any ransom not to go through it all again. "Stay," Sarah commanded. "I'm going to check up on Savannah," Ellison told her. He climbed up the staircase and went to the spare room. He opened it quietly, letting out just a faint squeak from the hinges as they slowly swung the door open and flicked the light on. Savannah was sound asleep, snuggled up on the large double bed and wrapped in the duvet. She was so small, and the bed so large that she looked almost lost in it. He couldn't help but smile slightly. He'd always wanted kids, but it had never turned out that way, though, and he'd accepted after divorcing Leela that it probably wouldn't happen. He wondered what the hell they were going to tell Savannah later on about her mother. How could he possibly tell her that what she thought was her mother was actually a machine? After losing her dad, too, she was an orphan, he realized. He thought about waking her up to tell her he and Sarah were back okay, but decided against it. He knew Sarah was prone to violence and didn't want Savannah to see or hear them questioning Danny. He'd try to make sure nothing happened to the kid, but he knew how Sarah's temper could get and didn't know if he'd be able to stop her if she lost it. As quietly as he could, he stepped further into the room and crossed to the window, looking back to make sure Savannah wasn't stirring. She remained still, sleeping deeply and taking long, slow breaths. She's a heavy sleeper, he thought to himself. If they failed to stop all this, that's something they'd have to change. He peeled the curtain back at the edge of the window and peered out into the street, half expecting to see a SWAT team or a Terminator approaching. Would I know one if I saw it? He asked himself. He'd suspected Kester Cromarty. Deep down, after everything he'd seen leading up to that point, he'd suspected. The interview with Silberman, his believing Sarah, and trying to kill him and her subsequent rescue, the hand, the evidence at Dr. Lyman's office, and actually speaking to Cromarty, sensing he wasn't normal. It had all added up, and in the back of his mind he'd seen enough to suspect it, he just hadn't wanted to believe it. What sane person would? He asked himself. But he'd believed it enough to send in the HRT team, just in case. He'd never imagined they'd be that powerful, though, that he'd be sending the team into that kind of slaughter. Now he knew the truth. But would he recognize one if it came to the door? He backed out of the room as quietly as he could and left Savannah alone, keeping the door open just a crack, and made his way downstairs. Sarah was still stood up in front of Danny. She turned to Ellison, still keeping one eye on their prisoner. "We need to tie him up," she gestured to Danny. She stood guard over him as Ellison went into the kitchen, leaving her alone with the kid. "What do you want from me?" he asked sullenly. "Shut up," she snapped at him. Now wasn't the time for talking. She wanted him to realize just who was in control here. A minute or so later, Ellison came back with a roll of duct tape and a wooden chair from his kitchen table. He put the chair down in the middle of the room, and Sarah gestured the pistol towards it. "Move," she said to Danny. Without a word, he got up and sat back down on the wooden seat. Sarah handed the gun to Ellison and took the roll of duct tape. She peeled the end off and stuck it to the chair, then went round Danny in circles, wrapping the tape tightly around his chest. When she was satisfied, he was secured, she worked on his arms and feet, fastening him tight to the chair. "Just tell me what you want." Danny growled at her, staring with a mix of fear and contempt. Who the hell are these people? Sarah ignored him, went into Ellison's kitchen and saw the washing machine in the corner, next to the back door. She saw laundry inside and opened it up. She took a moment to rummage around the clothes inside the drum, noting for a moment that they were dry, and pulled out a pair of black socks. She walked back into the kitchen as she rolled them up together and scrunched them into a ball. "Bad news," she told Danny. "These are dirty, but they won't kill you." She stood in front of him and looked down. "Open your mouth." Danny shook his head and kept his lips firmly clamped shut, flashing Sarah a glare of defiance. "Open your fucking mouth." Danny's chest exploded in pain as Sarah slammed her fist into his solar plexus and expelled all the air in his lungs, forcing his mouth open as he cried out and exhaled at the same time. The world spun around him and he gasped in agony and struggled to suck in some air, but Sarah rushed in before he could take a breath and forced the sock into his mouth, pushing it in as far as it would go and filling the cavity completely, pressing his tongue down and pinning it in place. Danny tried to work the sock free, but Sarah went back to the duct tape and wrapped it twice around his mouth and the base of his skull, preventing any chance of him working the sock loose. Ellison watched Sarah work and frowned slightly, not approving at all of how she was treating him, but knowing well enough to keep it to himself in front of Danny. They couldn't afford to appear undivided, and whilst Ellison knew he was the softer of the two, he didn't want him to pick up on that or try to plead with him. "He won't make any noise now," Sarah explained. The house's front door had a lock and key in the handle mounting, and she twisted until the door was secured and pulled the key out, placing it in her pocket. "Come here," she said to Ellison as she crossed the living room again and headed into the kitchen, flicking the light off and immersing the lounge in darkness. He followed, and the pair of them left Danny alone in the dark, with only his thoughts for company. Is it all right to leave him like that? He asked as he and Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. "He's not going anywhere," Sarah replied, keeping her voice low so Danny wouldn't be able to hear them. "We'll hear him if he tries to get free. The door's locked and your windows are double glazed." "And what if he chokes?" "He won't. I kept his nose clear so he could breathe." Ellison found Sarah's expertise on tying up hostages to be pretty disturbing. "How many times have you done this?" he asked. "Just once," she replied. They'd taped up the security guard at Cyberdyne and tied him to the toilet, not knowing at the time about the other guard whom they'd missed, who'd raised the alarm that had brought LAPD and the T-1000 down on them. At least, she figured, there was no chance of that happening this time. "What are we going to do with him?" Ellison asked. "For now, nothing," Sarah said. "I want him to sweat for a while." She wanted him to sit alone in the dark and think about what they might do to him, to get himself worked up worrying about who they were and what they wanted. A car engine sounded outside as it drove by, causing the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck to stand on end. She glanced at her watch, 0341. Who the hell would be out driving around here at this time of night? She listened as the sound from the car grew closer and rolled to a stop outside. "Shit. Have you got any neighbors out?" Sarah asked. "No," Ellison shook his head. None of his neighbors were likely to be out at this time of night, and when they'd driven in, he'd seen next door's car parked on the drive. "Shit." Sarah shot up out of her seat and instantly picked up her gun as a cold chill ran down her spine. How the hell had Kaliba found them? Ellison got up and reached for his own pistol, feeling sweat running down his temples in anticipation of an imminent fight. There could be a whole SWAT team out there, surrounding the house. Sarah pushed her way back into the living room and flicked the lights back on, ignoring Danny as she passed him and went to the window at the front of the room. She pulled back the curtain a hair and looked outside. There was a single car out front with the lights on, idling outside. She could make out a solitary figure in the front seat, but she couldn't see anyone else. Bang! 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 Sarah jumped as someone hammered loudly at the door, and she gripped her Glock that much tighter. Ellison followed up after her and reached for the door, but she stopped him. "Get behind the couch and get ready to shoot," she told him. Ellison did as she said and knelt down behind the sofa. He pulled his gun out and took aim over the back of the sofa at the front door and swallowed nervously. He glanced at Danny and saw the expression of fear and confusion on his face. We're in the same boat, he thought. None of them knew what was going to happen, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. Sarah held the gun in her right hand and reached for the door handle with her left, readying herself to take out the probable Kaliba goons on the other side. She slowly twisted the key and unlocked the door, turned the handle and pulled hard, stepping back a moment later and thrusting her gun forward like a fist. The door opened to reveal the person on the other side. Time stopped for Sarah, and her pistol dropped to the ground in utter shock. She almost joined it, as his knees started to buckle beneath her. All she could do was stare with wide, disbelieving eyes at the face she never thought she'd ever see again. "John!" John stood in the doorway and looked at her, a small smile on his face. "Mom!" He slowly stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight hug. It might have only been a week or two for her, but he'd spent over 3 months in the future. Sarah came back to her senses and squeezed him hard to her as tears flowed from her eyes, and she sobbed hard. A small voice in her head told her she was crazy. This was another vision like when she'd seen Kyle after being shot, or the imaginary sleep clinic. But he was here, she could feel him. She pulled back for a second and took a long, hard look at him, still not fully believing he was in here. He was thinner, more rugged. The youth in his face had been worn somewhat, and his eyes were harder, more intense. He looked like he'd aged since he'd left. And he needed a haircut. John pulled her back into a hug and tried to hold himself together. After recounting Ellison and Savannah's tale of Sarah, how she'd died holding off the SWAT team assault, he was overcome seeing her alive again. How? She'd honestly thought she'd never see him again. How the hell did he get back? She saw Cameron standing silently behind him and frowned. "You did this." She stared at Cameron with contempt. "You took him away." John pulled back out of her embrace and stepped beside Cameron. "It was my call." Sarah frowned but said nothing back. She'd always known John had been close to Cameron, too close for his own good. She would have melted down Cameron or blown her away 100 times over by now if it wasn't for John. If all the telltales of the past hadn't been enough, his going forward for her was the big smack in the face. She scrutinized the sight of John next to her, not quite touching, but only a fraction of a hair apart, and saw the solidarity between them. Whatever had happened in the future, the bond between her son and the cyborg had solidified. She didn't know how to feel about that. She decided to ignore it for now and just be happy that he was back. "I missed you, Mom." John's face softened once more and he sniffed back a few tears. He couldn't afford to start crying now, even tears of joy, or he'd risk breaking down after everything he'd gone through, and everyone who'd died because of him in the future. He noticed her hair was different and was thankful for the distraction. "What's with the hair?" he asked. He could hardly believe he hadn't noticed, until now that she was now blonde. "Disguise," she said plainly, knowing John would understand. She'd taught him several tricks to subtly mask his appearance enough that nobody would look at him twice. Ellison stood up from behind the couch and moved towards them, almost as awed as Sarah to see John and Cameron stood in the doorway. "How?" he asked, his eyes wide open in disbelief. He turned his gaze to Cameron. "We just buried you." Their plan must have worked, he realized. They'd buried Cameron in the ground, and John had found her. Judging by the hardened, wary look his face, Ellison reckoned he hadn't had an easy time doing it. He'd been aged beyond his years, and despite his young age, there was no way he could call John Connor a kid. John stepped inside the living room and saw Danny tied up to a chair, looking at him with dull, melancholy eyes. It was just like Ellison had told him. He leaned out of the doorway and waved to the car, calling Savannah over to them. She stepped out and jogged across the lawn, quickly entering the house. Cameron came in too, and the living room was filled to capacity. Savannah saw Ellison standing there, alive, and it filled her up. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. She was beyond words, and she trembled slightly at the shock of seeing him again. She hadn't prepared for this, and she didn't know how to handle it. Her Ellison was dead. The images of him disappearing in the middle of roiling clouds of smoke and plasma were still vivid in her mind's eye and always would be, but here he was. This was the same man who, in a week's time, would have been looking after her in Mexico. They were the same guy, and it took every ounce of willpower she had not to launch herself at him. Sarah stared at the new arrival. She was slender, wiry, and with a shock of bright red hair like fire, with a hard, determined look in her emerald eyes that matched John's and her own, the look of someone who'd been through far more than they should have. She stared at Ellison almost without blinking, not looking at anyone or anything else. Was she from the future? Had John brought someone else back with him? Who's she? Same little girl you've got sleeping upstairs, Savannah answered. No way. Sarah trailed off as she stared at the newcomer intently. It couldn't be, could it? She took a closer look at her face. She had freckles, just like Savannah. They had the same nose, the same lips, same eyes in color at least. This woman's eyes were harder than granite, though she saw a hint of softness as the girl continued to watch Ellison. I ate chocolate ice cream and a giant bag of Doritos when you left, and watched Hannah Montana before I went to bed. You seriously remember all that? Sarah asked, shocked. How could she recall that far back if she'd just come from 2027? Hell no, Savannah smirked dryly. But it's all there. She pointed to the empty tub, the pack of chips, and the open DVD case on the coffee table. I remember what happens in a few hours, though. Which is what? Ellison asked, trying to get his head around the fact there were two Savannahs under the same roof. It was hard. This kind of thing was mind-bending. At least she lived through Judgment Day, he thought. That was something. Him, Savannah pointed at Danny, staring hard at him. He leads Kaliba here. They attack tomorrow afternoon. Ellison had made her remember every detail of that day, down to the rough time of the attack, in case he hadn't made it as far as finding John. It had been their little insurance to make sure one of them survived to get him back. You should have made it back, she thought sadly. You could have sat down with yourself and a Bible and gone on about Jebus until the cows came home. She hoped he'd been right and there was something up there, but she couldn't believe it herself. Not after everything she'd been through. God was no substitute for 800 rounds a minute. Danny shook his head vigorously in denial, trying to say something, but only managing a muffled sound from his throat. Cameron stepped over and ripped the tape from his mouth. He spat the sock out of his mouth and breathed deeply in. He spat on the ground, desperate to get the taste of stale, sweaty feet out of his mouth, and he scraped his tongue along the bottom of his two front teeth. Thank you, he gasped. Get me out of here, he looked up at her pleadingly. Cameron did no such thing, however. She stared down at Danny and made no move to free him. She recognized that she'd grown and developed since arriving in the future, and she now understood the value of human life, but that didn't mean she wouldn't do what had to be done. She gripped him hard by the chin and squeezed, crushing his lower jaw in her unbreakable iron vice grip and causing him to squirm and cry out in pain. What the hell was this girl on? He wondered as he struggled to get out of her grasp, but he could barely move as it was, and she was just so strong it was unreal. "Please, stop," he cried out as tears came to his eyes, and he started sobbing. "I just want to go home," he sniffled. "Kaliba's tracking you," she told Danny. "How? Where's the tracking device?" "What tracking device?" Danny asked, incredulous. What the hell was she talking about? "Check his belt," Savannah suggested. "Shoes," Ellison supplied. Cameron shook her head in disagreement. They would make sense, but if Kaliba were run by machines, then they would be far more meticulous with such a high-priority employee and such a large potential security risk. "Clothes can be removed," she told them. She thought about what she would do if she wanted to track John everywhere he went, for his protection, and the answer was not to install a tracker in his clothes. "Have you had surgery recently?" she asked Danny. "No," he answered nervously. "What about any shots?" Sarah asked, remembering the deactivated one in her breast, and realizing Danny must have a similar one in him. "No." Danny snapped at her. This was ridiculous. They all belonged in the nut house. "What the fuck is wrong with you people? What do you want from me?" John stepped forward in front of Danny and crouched down, resting on his haunches and facing the tied-up young man. He stared evenly at him, trying to work out what to make of Guy in front of him. Danny was shitting himself, that was for certain. From what he knew, Danny Dyson had lived a very comfortable life. He remembered the house the Dysons had lived in and figured the kid moved in a very different world to the one he'd grown up in. Tough luck, John thought without a moment's sympathy. Danny was in his world now. "Do you know who we are?" John asked him. "No." Danny shook his head and stared back at John in confusion. He had no idea who the hell these people were, or what they wanted with him. He'd offered them money, but that wasn't it. He looked at the brunette, stood behind the guy talking to him. She was hot, and he knew it was a ridiculous thought to have when he was tied up, and who knew what was going to happen to him, but there it was. Then he realized he'd seen her before. The picture. The surveillance photo Knowles had shown him. She'd been in it, with John and Sarah Connor. He looked at the guy in front of him, and then at the older blonde woman. Oh shit. He swallowed nervously, as he recognized exactly who they were. He struggled in the chair, but to no avail, not that it would have mattered even if he somehow did manage to break free. There were 5 of them and only one of him, and the bald guy and Sarah had guns on them. "Now you know," Sarah smiled grimly, next to Ellison. "You're all crazy," Danny spat out. "Robots from the future, machines waging war against people. It wasn't enough you murdered my father, was it? You've got to kill me too, right?" "It's all true," John snapped Danny's attention back to him. He gripped Danny by the chin and angled his head straight towards his face, making sure he had a good look at every scar and bruise that had marred his skin. He was clean but still unshaven, and 2 weeks' worth of growth had sprouted out from his jaw and neck. "I've been to the future." He glared hard at Danny, locking their gazes together, and Danny shivered as he saw the tempered steel in his opposite. His eyes were flat, hard, intense, and he looked almost as if part of him were somewhere else. "Look into my eyes," John told him. "Take a good, long look. Imagine the things I've seen. All of this, it's gone. Ash, rubble. That's all that's left, that and the machines hunting for you day and night." Danny didn't believe him. This was all made-up delirium based on some fantasy they all bought into. But as he looked into John's eyes, he saw something he couldn't identify. He'd seen it in Knowles and his mercenaries, but it was much more intense in this instance. The eyes of someone who'd seen combat, who'd had to take a life, maybe. Apart from the stubble beard, the rough, scraggly hair and the pale, lily-white skin, he looked like he could have just come off the front line in Vietnam. Whatever the truth was, John Connor scared him even more than that psycho bitch mother of his. John got back up to his feet when he saw he hadn't completely swayed Danny and thought about what he could do to prove it. He really didn't want Cameron to have to peel her arm off this time. He knew she would, but he wouldn't ask her to do that. She answered his unasked question and stepped forwards, gripping him by the shirt. Cameron lifted Danny up by the cotton, chair and all, and raised him into the air. What the hell? Danny stared down at her in fear and utter shock at how such a petite girl could lift him clean off the ground like that. Cameron decided to push further, and she made her eyes glow a brilliant blue beneath her irises. "He's telling you the truth," she informed Danny, her voice deliberately as tinny and mechanical as possible. She scanned him for any reactions and felt him shiver as she spoke. He was sweating and shaking, and she could see he was afraid of her. People often were when they knew what she was, and she'd learnt that she could use that to her advantage. "I'm a machine, Danny." She switched her voice to mimic his own perfectly. "Terminator infiltration unit, built to imitate and kill humans." She lowered him steadily down to the ground and noted his dramatically increased pulse and breathing rate. But she wasn't done yet. "I need a knife," she told Savannah, noting that Danny gulped nervously at the mention of knife and knowing he expected her to kill or torture him. The redhead turned to the kitchen without hesitation and went through the door. She opened several drawers and rummaged through until he found the cutlery one. She picked out short, sharp vegetable knife with a blade only 3 inches long. Most people would think you couldn't do much with a knife so small, but she knew differently. In the hands of an expert, 3 inches was more than enough to do some serious damage. As good as she had no doubt that Cameron would be better. She picked out another similar knife and stuffed it into the hem of her skirt and fished around for any other useful ones. They were either all too big or too blunt, so she stuck with the small one for now. She returned to the living room and handed Cameron the vegetable knife. Danny watched the blade with wide, scared eyes as it passed between them. Cameron brushed her hair away from the left side of her head with her free hand and reached up with the knife. John smiled slightly as he realized what Cameron was going to do. If this wasn't the proof Danny needed, then nothing would do. He thought back to when Uncle Bob did it for Miles, and his smile grew in anticipation of how Danny would react. With her free hand holding her hair out of the way, Cameron expertly cut into her scalp and dragged the blade along, creating a rough incision into her skin, deep down until the tips scraped along her skull. "What the fuck?" Danny tried to look away, but Savannah grabbed his head and forced him to look. How the hell could she cut into her own scalp like that, without even flinching? "You fucking watch," she growled. He stared forward in horror, unable to move his head away and with no other choice but to look on at the gruesome sight of Cameron cutting into her own head. She cut a large semicircle into her scalp and peeled the flap of skin to the side, exposing the shiny metal skull beneath, stained with crimson blood. Danny just stared, mouth agape at the skull. Metal, not bone. What the hell? In Cameron's expert hands, it took only a flick of the knife to open the port cover, which she held in her hand. She got down onto her knees in front of Danny and revealed her chip, embedded deep inside her skull, surrounded by a faint blue glow emanating from within. "What the hell is that?" he asked, unable to stop staring now, even if Savannah wasn't holding his head in place. They weren't bullshitting him. Shit, she must have been one of those cyborgs his employers had warned him about. They'd never found the one they'd said would be in Zyra Corp. Was she the one they'd meant? "That's my CPU," Cameron answered. "Neural net processor." "It can't be," he whispered, not believing what he was seeing. Kaliba had told him about cyborgs that looked human, but he'd expected some clunking, clumsy thing. Human appearance only in the most basic sense. Essentially like a moving mannequin. He'd never expected them to look this human. How the hell was this possible? The technology for this didn't exist. A walking, talking, thinking cyborg that looked and sounded completely human and even bled. Still, he couldn't quite believe all of this. They can't build things like that yet. It's impossible. Not for about 12 years, Savannah replied. This is all real, he sniffed, realizing they were telling the truth. Her CPU told him everything he'd needed to know. He'd grown up around computers, knew everything about them, and he knew nothing that small could control a machine like that. There wasn't a computer on Earth that small that could essentially be a brain for something as complex as the machine girl in front of him. Not even the Japanese were that far ahead. She was from the future. Everything they'd said was true. What are you going to do with me? We're not here to kill you, Danny, Ellison said calmly. We're here to stop you making a mistake that will get billions of other people killed. I don't understand, he replied meekly. You say it, Sarah told John. I've told it 100 times now. She was sick of trying to tell people horrific truth that nobody wanted to hear, and worse, being branded crazy for it. You're building an AI for the Kaliba group, Cameron stated, matter of fact. Danny nodded once. It's for the Air Force, he said. A functioning AI worth billions to them. Your AI blows up the world and kills everyone, Savannah spelt it out for him. Everyone dies, and it's your fault. No, Danny shot back. I wouldn't. I'd never do that. He couldn't accept it. There was no way he was responsible for destroying the whole world. Not you, John replied. Kaliba, they turn your AI into Skynet and turn it against mankind. You're working for people who are trying to bring about the end of the world. I won't do it, Danny said firmly. I'll quit. Sarah shook her head slowly. Your father tried that. He died trying to stop it from happening. These aren't the kind of people you can just hand your notice to and walk away from. Danny looked at all of them in turn, his eyes pleading still. So what the hell can I do? You can start by telling us where you had any shots since you started working for Kaliba, John said. He nodded slowly and breathed in, trying to think back. I went on a few research trips to Asia, he recalled. Not long after I took the job. Japan, China, South Korea. My doctor said I'd need shots to travel there for malaria and all. I had them a week before I went. Where did they give you the shot? Cameron asked. Right arm, he replied. Crease of the elbow. Cameron stood up and placed the port cover back over her chip, sealing it in place, and flattened her scalp back over it. She'd stitch it back in place later on to ensure it healed properly, but for now there were more important issues. She cut through the tape, holding Danny's arms in place, and held up his right one. She turned to John and Savannah. I need you to hold him, she instructed them. John held down onto Danny's shoulders, making sure he'd sit still in the chair, knowing what Cameron was about to do. Savannah gripped his arm by the wrist and held it out straight, keeping a firm grasp on the limb. What are you doing? Danny asked, as Cameron lowered the bloody knife to the crook of his elbow. I told you what you wanted to know. Why were they doing this to him when he'd tell them everything? There's a tracking device in your arm, Cameron explained to him. We need to remove it, or Kaliba will know where we are. Hold very still. This will hurt. A lot. Without hesitation, Cameron sliced the blade down into his arm. Danny screamed out and bucked in his seat as the knife carved into him, but John held him down firmly. He cried out and struggled to pull his arm away, but Savannah clutched onto it, and he had no choice but to take the searing, white-hot pain as the blade cut roughly into his skin, more suited to chopping vegetables than cutting into flesh. It was coarse and made it even more painful. Don't move, Cameron repeated firmly as she finished her incision and started to probe the inside of his elbow with the tip of the knife. scanning with her keen vision for any sign of something that shouldn't be in there. She found it quickly but saw that it would be complicated. "It's 2 millimeters from the radial artery," she told him. "You have to be very still. If you move, I could cut it and you'll bleed to death." "He won't handle it," Sarah said, watching as he'd flinched when the knife had only just touched his skin, let alone cut through it. It wasn't anything to be ashamed of, she knew. Some people had a high pain threshold, and some didn't. It was just bad luck for Danny that he fell into the latter group. "He'll flinch." "Let him go," Cameron told John and Savannah. Both released him and stepped away. She wasn't going to cause him any more pain than absolutely necessary, and she agreed with Sarah. If it was Sarah or John or Savannah she was operating on, she'd know they could cope with the pain. But Danny would flinch. It was too much of a risk to his life. But without any anesthesia, there was only one option. Cameron drew her fist back and punched Danny hard in the face. He cried out as his head snapped backwards, and a moment later he fell limp, leaning forward where he was still taped to the chair from the waist up. Cameron placed 2 fingers by his carotid artery and checked for a pulse. It was slow and steady. He was unconscious, but she knew that it was difficult to predict when he might come to again. She worked quickly, twisting the knife into his elbow, and without him struggling, it took only a moment for her to extract it. She held the tracking device up between her thumb and forefinger, a miniature transmitter that looked like just a small thread of wire, 4 millimeters long, if that, and 0.5 millimeter wide. "It's out," she told the others. She lowered Danny's arm onto his lap and held it out for the others to see. "Crush it," Savannah said. Sarah nodded in agreement. "Stop it transmitting." "Not yet," John said. He turned to Savannah. "They come tomorrow afternoon, right? When it's daytime." "Yeah. We've got a good few hours until dawn, so we know they won't be here for a while. If they lose the signal, they'll know we're onto them, and they'll come sooner. They might as well stick with what they knew," he thought. Another thought struck him, too. "I'm sick of running and hiding." It was all he'd done for weeks before he'd met Ellison and Savannah in the future, and he was tired of it. Time to take the fight back to them and fire the first shot across the bow. "Have we got any more Semtex?" "Yeah," Sarah said, wondering what her son was up to. "Why?" John's face set in stone as he turned to his mom, his expression more terse and serious than she'd ever seen in him before. "We're going to send Kaliba a message. We're declaring war. They'd make their first strike against them here.